time, your electricity bill was, well, pretty straightforward. But that's all about to change. There's a new set of rules on the table, and we're not talking about some far-off policy dream. These are nitty-gritty changes that are going to directly hit how millions of us, and especially big businesses, pay for power.
So let's kick things off with a pretty basic question. Do you think electricity should cost the same at 2 p.m. on a sunny afternoon as it does at, say, 8 p.m. when everyone's at home? For most of India's history, the answer was, yeah, of course. You just paid a flat rate for every unit you used. Didn't matter what time it was. And you know what? For a long time, that totally made sense.
And this is where we hit the big problem. Think about it. Our old grid was built around coal. Coal is predictable, right? It runs 24/7, giving us a nice, stable cost. But the new grid, it's all about solar. And solar means we're swimming in cheap power when the sun's out, but when it goes down, power suddenly gets scarce and way more expensive. That old flat-rate system just can't keep up. It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll really dig into why those old flat rates are becoming such a headache. Then we're going to look at 3 big ideas the new rules are pushing: using price as a signal, putting an end to what's essentially a free battery system, and even making some folks get their own power banks. And stick with me, because at the end, we'll see why all this kind of boring stuff actually matters a whole lot. All right, first things first, let's talk about the core problem. India has gone all in on solar, which is awesome, but it's created this wild imbalance on our power grid. It's a feast or famine situation. We've got this flood of super cheap, clean power all day long, but the second the sun sets, it turns into a mad dash for whatever expensive power is left. And if you look at the energy exchange on any given day, the problem just stares you right in the face. During the day, when the sun's blazing, there's a ton of power being offered up for sale, but not that many people are buying it. That huge gap, that's just wasted energy. Then, boom, evening hits, that surplus disappears and the prices shoot through the roof. A flat tariff just pretends none of this is happening. So how in the world do you fix this? Well, the first step is to send a really clear signal to everyone using power. And let's be honest, the clearest signal is always price, right? This brings us to the first huge change in these new rules, bringing in something called time of day tariffs, or TOD for short. The idea behind a TOD tariff is actually pretty simple. It just means you pay less for electricity when there's a ton of it available, like during those sunny solar hours, and you pay more when the grid is really stressed out, which we call peak hours. The whole point is to give you a real financial nudge, a reason to maybe run your heavy appliances in the afternoon instead of right after work. Let's put some numbers on this. Say your normal rate is 10 rupees for a unit of power. Under the new rules, during those sunny solar hours, the price has to be at least 20% cheaper, so 8 rupees. But during peak evening hours, it has to be at least 20% more expensive, so 12 rupees. You see that? That's a 40% price swing in a single day. That is definitely enough to make a factory manager think really hard about when they fire up the heavy equipment. Now, this was all supposed to be in place already, but the rollout of smart meters, the tech you need to even do this kind of billing, has been kind of slow. So these new rules are basically hitting the reset button with new deadlines. Big commercial and industrial users get until April 2027, and pretty much everyone else has until April 2028. The writing is on the wall. Get ready for a world where when you use power is just as important as how much. Okay, the next big change is aimed at anyone with rooftop solar, especially the really big systems. And this one is all about shutting down a loophole that has, for years, let some people use the entire public grid as their own personal and totally free battery. So here's how it works right now with something called net metering. Picture a huge factory with a roof covered in solar panels. In the middle of the day, it's making way more power than it can use. So what happens to all that extra juice? It gets pushed back onto the grid. Your meter actually spins backward. But then night comes. The solar panels are asleep. So the factory starts pulling power from the grid. At the end of the month, the electricity company looks at how much they sent out versus how much they brought in. And if those numbers match up, their net usage is 0, and they pay basically nothing. I mean, this quote just nails it. The local utility, the discom, is basically acting as a free battery for that factory. They're storing their cheap afternoon solar power and withdrawing it as super expensive evening power for free. But here's the kicker. It's not actually free. The cost of running the grid and providing that evening power, that gets passed on to everyone else, to regular folks who don't have a giant solar array on their roof. So the new rules are tackling this head on. they're letting states bring in a net metering charge. But, and this is the really important part, they've been smart about it. Your typical home rooftop system, anything under 5 kilowatts, is completely exempt. But for the bigger systems, there's going to be a charge. And it gets bigger the bigger your system is. The goal isn't to discourage rooftop solar. Not at all. It's just to say, hey, using the grid as a giant battery isn't a free service anymore. All right, now we get to the third and honestly the most aggressive part of these new rules. The government's thinking is, for the absolute biggest power users, maybe a price change here and a fee there isn't enough of a push. So they're introducing a new, much bigger lever, the power to literally mandate that you install your own power bank. Yeah, this one is aimed squarely at the big fish, what we call prosumers, who both produce and consume a lot of power. Specifically, those with renewable energy systems over 500 kilowatts. So think about huge industrial parks, giant shopping malls, sprawling warehouses, maybe even big hospital campuses. That's who's in the crosshairs here. And what's so game-changing about this is that for the first time, state regulators will have the legal power to force one of these big private companies to install a battery system. Now, it's not automatic. The rule says they may do it, not that they must. It's a tool in their toolbox, and you can bet it's a tool that's going to get used first in states with tons of solar, like Rajasthan, Gujarat, and Tamil Nadu, places where the grid is already screaming for help in the middle of the day. So let's zoom out for a second. We've talked about 3 different rule changes, right? The time of day prices, the net metering charges, and these new storage mandates. And yeah, by themselves, they might sound like really technical, kind of boring tweaks. But when you line them all up, you start to see a really clever, cohesive plan for building the kind of grid we actually need, one that's modern, stable, and green. Here's how it all works like a beautiful puzzle. First, the TOD tariffs create that big 40% price swing, which suddenly makes having a battery look like a really smart financial move. Second, the net metering charges slam the door on that free battery loophole. And third, for the giants who still aren't getting the message, the storage mandate gives regulators the ultimate nudge. See? Each piece makes the others work better. And why is this all so urgent? Why now? Because our ambition to build solar has gotten way ahead of our grid's ability to handle it. Just think about this. In 2025 alone, India had to curtail, which is a fancy word for throw away, 2.3 terawatt hours of perfectly good solar power. In some states, we're talking about wasting almost a third of the solar energy we could be generating. We're building all these amazing solar farms, but we literally can't use all the clean power they're making. And this really gets to the core of it all. We all love the big, exciting visions of a green future. But none of that happens without what this quote perfectly calls the boring grid plumbing. That's exactly what these rules are. These tariffs, these charges, these mandates, they're the essential, unglamorous, behind-the-scenes work that will actually make India's clean energy dream a reality. So when you boil it all down, these new rules aren't just about bills and regulations. They're really about fundamentally rewiring our entire relationship with energy. They're trying to turn our grid from a dumb, one-way street into a smart, dynamic system. And that really leaves all of us with a final big question to chew on. As our grid finally starts to get smarter, are we ready to get smarter too? Are we ready to change not just where our power comes from, but how and, more importantly, when we use it?